So, now let's prepare to dive deep into the exploration of how data shapes our perceptions, our decisions, and our interactions in an increasingly digitized world. With our speaker on this next session, the topic is the psychology of data. Our speaker for this session is the esteemed silver sponsor, Young Q Fan, who is the CEO of Finite Business Solutions LLC. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Young Q Fam.
Everybody? Can everybody? All right. Good morning, everybody. I think the mic's working. All right. I appreciate it. It was kind of hard to convince everyone to come out to Las Vegas for these meeting of the minds, right? I know it was very difficult for me when they asked me to come out here as well. So I also want to go ahead and thank everyone that's online streaming right now with us as well. This conversation has been a culmination of probably a few years of Finite Business Solutions attending this conference. A few years back, we were on a panel talking about the importance of business analytics, right? Data analysis. Last year, I did a topic regarding navigating labor shortages in post-COVID landscapes. So a little bit about myself. Finite Business Solutions is a singular platform. I'm going to go ahead probably. You want to just do the mic? Perfect. All right, good. I hate over tapping and whistling on these things. So, all right. So, Finite Business Solutions plays in the HOA sector, in the homeowners association market. And what we do is we are a singular platform for any kind of accounting outsourcing for HOAs for the real estate market. We can also handle all the resale processing, and we also build data aggregation and delinquency programs for these. What we've really built our niche on is the fact that we are probably one of the few outsourcing U.S. accounting firms that are still U.S. based. None of our people work remotely. They're all housed in our secure facilities in Austin, and they work, very well together as a team because they're all U.S. based accountants. So it's probably one of the few people that still do that. A little bit of background about me. I was actually born in Saigon, Vietnam, and I migrated to the United States with my mother and my aunt in 1984. This really helped shape a lot of what I got to see from them growing up being assembly workers throughout the United States, based off of Dallas. Part of my background was I've spent almost 3 decades now in the accounting and finance field, and that spreads the gamut of real estate, HOA, even the car industry, publicly traded, privately traded companies. And my education background has to do with accounting, finance, business, and weirdly enough, psychology. And that's kind of where we're going to lead into this topic today. It's funny where life ends up leaving you, right? You never really think when you're in school where you're going to end up, right? When I first started the HOA market, I had no idea what the HOA market was. And now today, it's one of the things that we deal with on a 24/7 basis. Well, what I learned years and years ago from school, the little that I did remember from school, was that there's elements of this psychology that we can apply. And especially nowadays with organizational psychology, with industrial psychology, how big it is, even in the business sector, right? So what I want to do is, the topic of today is the psychology of data, right? This is not going to be one of those topics where I'm going to throw a bunch of statistics up there, a bunch of graphs up there, and then you guys are going to wait for the next speaker to talk, right? I really want you guys to think of data as a more simplistic idea, right? I want you to think of it as pockets of information. When you do an interview for your next hire on your team, that's data that you're collecting. That's information you're collecting. When you guys are in a boardroom and you're looking at your P&L, that's data, right? We're not talking about super advanced. There's some extremely intelligent people at this conference today that do AI, data aggregation, that do data modeling. You know, they're looking at data anomalies. We're not talking about that. We're looking at a more simplistic form of data. And from that, we look at the evolution of a business as it goes to several stages of the business. And during those evolutions, your mentality of how you make decisions change. The psychology of that information change. And at the end of the day, what you want out of this discussion is you want to turn data into answers. Instead of looking at just pockets of information, if you see answers out of them, answers that make better decisions for your business long term, then you've won, right? Then you've really started to understand where you're at and what stage of your business. So, striving for business transcendence. Cool word. I think I kind of understand what it means, but the point of it is when we start to look at psychology, right, when we look further back in the 20th century, there's a gentleman named Abraham Maslow, and it's very difficult to talk about how humans have motivations and choices they make without bringing up Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So raise your hand if anybody still remembers Psychology 101 and still remembers the pyramid of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I'm seeing a few hands, so I'm proud of you guys. So it took me a while to actually go back and review some of these to make sure I had the steps right. We're going to very quickly go through these because I want to show you guys how this actually applies to the business sector as well, right? One caveat to keep in mind as we continue this conversation. This pyramid does not mean that there's one thing that's more important than the next. It's more of a foundational stepping stone. It's also larger at the bottom and smaller at the top because fewer people ever actually get to the very top of self-actualization, okay? So the first step of this is physiological needs. Those are things such as air, water, food, reproduction. Those are things you have to have just to survive, right? After you master that, or at least you're able to be comfortable, you move on to the safety stage. The safety stage is your personal security. Even within society, do I feel like the government's protecting me, right? And you know, am I secure? Do I have a job? Can I start to save money from the job that I have? Once we get past those first two phases, we now get into kind of more ephemeral ideas. We're now talking about love and belonging. Do I belong to society? Do I have a purpose? Is there a counterpart in this world? Have I found my soulmate, right? And then once you get through that and you start having a little bit more familiarity with that, then you have the esteem stage. The esteem is, as you would think, self-esteem, recognition, freedom, strength. And at the very top is a real big word, self-actualization. But all self-actualization means is, am I at a point where I can realize my true potential? Okay? It's not going to be a test at the end. You guys don't have to write any of this down, right? So, all right, so let's talk about business perspective. I like to build up something called the business hierarchy of needs. And it's very similar to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, except we're applying it on a business entity level rather than an individual level. At the very bottom of a business hierarchy of needs is survivability, right? Survivability, what does that mean? Do I have any core products and services that anybody wants? Do I have money to start this thing? Or more importantly, do I have somebody that will give me money to start this thing, right? Do I have office space? Do I have a team? Do I have coffee, right? Once you get to that point, you move up to the next step, which is sustainability. Now you're starting to feel pretty good, right? You've made payroll a couple weeks in a row. You're starting to offer people employee benefits. Now you're at a sustainability stage. You're not necessarily afraid on whether or not your next day's revenue check is going to come in anymore. So once you get to that stabilization phase, now you start to think cultural ethos, right? It's a big buzzword in the last 10, 15 years, this idea of culture, building culture, right? Businesses love throwing that in your face, all these values, all these mission statements, all these culture. But how many of them actually abide by it? How many of those employees know the culture that they speak of on these advertisements, right? Cultural ethos. Your team feels the sense of inclusion. Your brand feels that it's part of the fabric of that market. Now we're getting into some really crazy words, okay? I had to look these up. These are like old SAT words. Ubiquitous is the next stage up. This is a very interesting stage because at this point in your business, you are dealing with the fact that your business's competitors don't actually matter that much anymore, right? And the next slide, I'm going to go over a couple examples on each of these stages just so we can kind of have something for food for thought, right? So you've starting to become a household name. What you do in the market is really irrelevant to what your competitor is doing, which sounds kind of strange, but there are examples of that exist today, right? And then the final really self-actualization of business is transcendence. Transcendence is the concept that stands the test of time. This is a generational company. This is a generational brand, right? It almost feels like it's a societal necessity. And I even, on the next slide, when I started thinking of examples of companies that are transcendent, it's still very difficult. Because you look at a lot of companies, right? Sears today has, I think, like maybe 12 or 13 stores left open. You look at like Barnum and Bailey Circus, right? They were around in like the 1884, and they went out of business in 2017, right? So you may think a company's transcendent, but if they don't continue to evolve with the changing times, it doesn't matter. So let's look at some examples of this. So survivability, what I like to consider these are, we actually had a donut shop around our house that just opened up recently, right? But donuts aren't bad. The funny thing is the name of the place is called Donuts, right? They don't care about brands. They want their local neighborhood just to come in. There's about 200 people in that area. That's all they want their business from. There's nothing wrong with that. But they're in a survivability mode. Sustainability to me is kind of like the next rung up, which is you have all these regional car dealerships, right? It's a car dealership that's not like a large brand across the country like a Penske Automotive Group or anything like that. But maybe they have 2 or 3 locations in your city, right? Again, not a whole lot of brand awareness. There's the localization of brand awareness. But the reality is if they went out of business and somebody came in and started selling the same trucks or the same cars, would anybody really notice? Probably not, right? Now we start moving up the ladder, and this is where it starts to get interesting, right? And this is where we had some debates about some proper examples of this. Cultural ethos. I don't know how many of you guys have seen this. The next time you do, go on YouTube and look at a lot of the things that come out about Southwest Airlines, and it's actually quite remarkable, right? Their business model is they actually put their employees before the client, and they mean that. And their employees show that. And I think you guys can tell because it's such a strange business model compared to all the other airlines out there where you pick your own seat and you kind of line up and stuff like that. There's not really a whole lot of caste systems that we're dealing with in other airplanes, but yet it works because of the customer service level. And that customer service level is because the employees are first. So to me, when I think of cultural ethos, I immediately think of Southwest Airlines. Then you think of ubiquitous. Okay, so this is a tough one. This is a hard stage because at this point, you've almost replaced yourself and you've become like your own verb, right? Think of Google. Whenever you want to say, hey, can you look something up for me? Can you Google it, right? Nobody says, can you Bing it, right? Nobody cares. Nobody even knows what that is, right? Like as many times as other people are going to try to force other browsers and other search engines, we Google stuff. We don't even know what Google really means, but we know it means search for stuff. Right? Search online. So that has become ubiquitous at this point. And then we start talking about transcendence. This one's hard. I'm not even quite sure Apple is completely at this stage, but Apple no longer sells products and services, ladies and gentlemen. They sell brand, right? They sell a lifestyle, right? It's similar to luxury brands and cars and watches or whatever you want to have it. It's something that, for the most part, is probably not a necessity, but in our minds, we view it as a necessity, to the point where sometimes we'll go into debt just to get it. Apple, probably not quite that far, but those are kind of the examples of when you're talking about a company that's probably going to stand the test of time and has withstood so many different leaderships, right? So now that we get to that part, let's talk about the role of data analytics in business. So the reason this is important is as you go through each stage, if your business right now is in a survivability stage or it's in a sustainability stage, you're going to be collecting different data, and you're going to be interpreting that data differently, right? When you first start your donut shop, you're not going to have a mission statement. You don't even know what that is, right? So what I want to do is go over some key examples of what we're talking about with each one of these stages. So when we're talking about survivability, probably the overarching question you want to ask yourself is, do I have the resources to start this thing off, right? When do I need to add my first employee? How do I get funding when I run out of money, right? These are questions you need to be answering. And this is the data that you're answering yourself. This is the data you need to go out and collect, right? And when we say data collection, again, we're not talking about tens and thousands of lines of data. It could be something as simple as Googling all the different interest rates that you'd have to deal with on a personal loan right now, especially with the Fed constantly increasing the interest rate these days, right? Be prepared for that. What if after 6 months you actually do survive and you need more money and you don't have it and you can't ask more investors, you have to borrow it? How much interest rate are we dealing with? Once you tack on that 10, 15% interest rate, do you still have the funds to make it work, right? Am I charging enough for my products? That's actually a much harder question to answer than you think, right? Look at comparables. Does it make any sense anymore? I mean, it's funny, my business partner, Crossy, who also is a co-founder of Finite Business Solutions with me, she's also a real estate agent, right? And we've had conversations for years about this standard 3% commission thing, right? And we don't really know where that came from. At least I don't. Much smarter people in this room could probably answer that question for me. But it felt like over time it just became a thing, right? Here's 6%, here's 3%, here's 3%. Total 6%, that's the cost of selling your house. But no one ever really took the time to look at the math of why we do that, right? So it's important for us to understand why we charge what we do. And it needs to be just much more than, well, I'm going to charge this, somebody's going to pay this, and I got some stuff left over, right? So that's survivability. We get to sustainability. Now we're starting to get kind of smart. Now we're starting to get a little bit more advanced. Now we're talking about, does my plan, like, do I have a plan for making critical business decisions, right? Is my company's performance tied to seasonality? So when you're looking at your P&L and you're noticing that in March and August, you're not making as much money, don't just chalk that up as seasonality. Figure out why. Right? Look at more in depth into data. What are the different things you're doing in your business that is not that great in May or in August? It couldn't be a coincidence, right? How much should I pay my middle leadership team, right? The backbone of your leadership team is usually the folks that have to deal with higher level executives, but at the same time have people they oversee. Does their pay rate make any sense? How do I build a fence around all the talent that I have in my company, right? What happens if my company loses 2 of our top 5 clients? How do we pivot? Know the impacts of things like that. That's the data analysis we're looking at. You don't have to be fancy. You don't have to go out and get a senior data analyst that gets paid 6 figures a year. These are things we need to know when we're looking at key performance indicators, KPIs for your own business. And it doesn't matter how large or small your business is. These are fabric questions that you need to start thinking about now, because the worst thing that's going to happen is continue to be around and growing. Cultural ethos. Is this the right team, right? What are the main reasons my employees quit? Make sure you're getting exit interviews. Force people to get exit interviews as best as you can. I know it's a hard situation because most people just want to leave at that point, right? But you got to know why, right? That's data. Does my team participate in off-site voluntary events? Right? When I throw the holiday party in a year, if only 40% of the people are showing up, is it because I picked the wrong date, or is it because nobody there likes each other? It's kind of an important thing to think about, right? Do our folks train their own colleagues? Look at training manuals. That's collecting data. Is it a congruent training manual? Is it too robotic? Are we taking into account that people learn differently? Some people are visual learners. Some people need repetition. And are our leaders in our own companies doing those things, taking the time to do those things? Or is it, you're going to shadow me for 2 weeks and then good luck, right? That's cultural ethos. That goes well beyond just pay in the corner office. All right, ubiquitous. Are we the best in class, right? Or do we at least have the market share? I forgot what movie I saw this from once, but basically they said you either need to be first or you need to be the best, right? Well, that's complicated and it's hard because there's like probably 2 companies in every sector that has that claim, right? But how are we perceived? And does anybody in here know what a net promoter score is? A few of you guys, right? So when you're collecting data, you want to know analysis from your clients on how they view you. And also what a net promoter score does is if you ask your clients today, would they promote you to new clients, right? Those are very important things to understand. Even if a client stays with you for a very long time, they may not be the biggest champion of your product. for whatever reason, maybe change is hard and they don't want to change, right? So know what other people perceive you. I mean, honestly, to me, that's probably the pillars of psychology itself. Spatial awareness individually, knowing how others perceive you, even just walking around the casino floor, right? Like, just being able to understand. I'm not saying you should care about every single detail of what people think about you, but you should have a pretty decent idea of how you're perceived to others, right? What's your value? What's your proposition? You can't be a ubiquitous, you can't Google it if you don't have a purpose or a value of what your company's doing. And finally, transcendence. At this stage, you are the front of the pack, right? You are the alpha dog. How do we lead from the front? Which means now you're thinking of questions of, what are we doing in the next decade, right? How do we maintain what differentiates us from everybody else in the market? And it's something that they can replicate. Can others duplicate what we do? That's how you stay in the transcendent phase, if any of us are ever fortunate enough to ever be in that spot, right? So, we've talked about the psychology, the motivating factors of why businesses do what they do, and the evolution as you go up through all these various stages. We've talked about examples of different data points, little pockets of information that you're trying to gather, just so you can kind of move from one stage to the next, right? To really evolve as a business. Well, one of the things I do want to address is the dangers of inaccurate data conclusions, right? That's a mouthful. But at the end of the day, it's very simple. There's a ton of different fallacies. They're called data fallacies out there. That as you analyze and you collect all this data, you collect all this information, right? You've gone crazy, you guys get excited, you go home, you tell your entire staff, we're going to start doing a bunch of surveys, we're going to start collecting a bunch of stuff, and then nobody's going to get any work done, right? We have to make proper decisions on what you're doing at that point. So, there's 3 very common data fallacies out of dozens of data fallacies. Keep in mind, fallacies by definition come from back when in the day where, remember anybody used to diagram sentences and figure out what the verb is and everything? And then we went into logic games of if A, then B, if not, then so forth, right? There's 3 common data fallacies I see all the time as I do consulting and as I work with even our internal teams and our external clients. The first one, gambler's fallacy. I had to throw this one in there just because we're in Las Vegas, right? So the gambler's fallacy is very simple. It's the belief that if something happens more frequently now, it will happen less frequently later, right? And I put up a case in point and a little bit of a tip here, so you guys are welcome later tonight when you guys go play roulette, right? The screen that shows you the last few rolls in roulette is the biggest scam mathematically when it comes to roulette, right? They love showing you, oh my God, it's been 10 red rolls in a row. That means it's gotta be black, right? That's incorrect. Probability is probability. If I flip a coin, it's 50-50, right? Even if it goes up heads 5 times, it doesn't mean it's gonna be more likely to be tails. It's still 50-50 heads or tails. So take that as food for thought the next time you guys start gambling. Cherry-picking data. Cherry-picking data is the idea of selecting results or data information that is specific to you and only helps you out, right, while ignoring other stuff. This was a very interesting case, and I remember this back in 2007. Colgate was running these crazy commercials. I think you guys saw them all over the billboards and also on TV. And they said that 4 out of dentists recommend Colgate. Well, that sounds really impressive, right? 80% of dentists like Colgate. What they failed to tell you was that when they surveyed all these dentists, the dentists were allowed to name as many different brands as they wanted to. So maybe 80% is great, but what if they were like the bottom 5 and everybody else was recommending 100 or 95%, right? So when you're looking at your data and you're trying to figure out your next business moves, think about things like that, right? And then probably the worst one, especially if you ever follow politics, if you ever try to look at a presidential debate, is false causality. This is such a common thing. And honestly, us humans, we all make that same mistake as well, right? It's the idea that if you have 2 separate variables and they correlate, that implies some kind of causation to it, right? So an example of that would be, I went out, I have a restaurant, I bought a new plant last week, and then a bunch of people came in over the weekend. So now I can safely make the assumption every time I buy a new plant, I get more people coming in the restaurant. Well, if you put it in that context, that's pretty silly, right? Well, it's funny because in psychology, one of the first examples of fallacies that we learned was this weird survey they did back in, I believe it's the 70s or 80s, where there was a higher crime and death rate when people were eating more ice cream. Well, obviously, there's no correlation between, violence and ice cream. At least I don't think there is, right? But that was an example to show you guys, just because two things correlate for whatever reason that they correlate does not necessarily mean that it has a cause and effect relationship at all with them. So, how do we mitigate data fallacies? Well, there's 4 basic things you can do, right? One of the things you want to do is when you're looking at, let's say your P&L, and you're noticing there's outliers, there's something that doesn't tell the story correctly. Just like if you're playing poker and you're trying to figure out if someone's lying to you or not, right? If the story doesn't make sense, there's probably a reason why it doesn't make sense. Don't just naturally assume that, man, you killed it in March, that just leave the P&L alone. Maybe you double accrued that month, right? So that's one of the things you want to do is always research any kind of data outliers. Know the difference between correlations, right? We just talked about false causality. Be mindful if your data sample is too small. That's one of the biggest things that we have a problem with data. Data over time, just like probability in math, over a large sample size, it's accurate. Over a small sample size, it is not. Make sure you're sampling enough data. And create clear goals and objectives before collecting and analyzing your data. The last thing I want to touch on is the psychological soul of data, right? As we're winding down this conversation, I want you guys to take a minute to just kind of breathe. Think of all the concepts that we've gone over today. And also have the harsh truth, which is most of us will spend a lifetime oscillating between survivability and sustainability in a company, right? It's really awesome to stand up here and say we're all going to run transcendent companies. We're all going to run companies that have ubiquitous brands. But it's just not realistic. But it doesn't mean that as we operate, we don't look at core values of mission statements, of principles, of cultural ethos. Those are still permanently ingrained in how we do everything. Henry Ford once said, "A business that makes nothing but money is a poor business." And I wholeheartedly believe that. In psychology, you deal with this comparative analysis thing. And it's probably one of the darkest parts of our human nature. It's this concept that we don't know what we are, but we know what we're not, right? I don't know if I'm doing well financially. I know I'm richer than my cousin. I know I'm better off than someone else. I don't know if my house is big enough for me, but I know it's smaller than someone else's house, right? In the business sector, that's where you find all the greed and filth in every market in the same sense as well. So as we go through this journey, the only thing I ask you guys is to try to build something sustainable, something with an identity, and something with a business soul, and to keep that business soul intact. Thank you.